Disobedience, in the eyes of anyone who has read history, is man's original virtue. It is through disobedience that progress has been made, through disobedience and through rebellion. And this disobedience, Wilde tells us, really is a product of the dehumanization, the alienation, and the hardening of the spirit that capitalism imposes on people.
Hello and welcome to Everyday Anarchism. My guest today, I'm going to try and get this right, is Deaglán O'Donnell. Is that right?
Yes, that's perfect.
And we are here to discuss Oscar Wilde. Especially I want to cover Oscar Wilde's essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, but we also will have to talk to him about his life, which is a story that probably many of you have a rough sense of what happened in Oscar Wilde's life, but I imagine very few of you, unless you're coming to this podcast already knowledgeable about anarchism, understand his engagement with radical politics. So, Deaglán, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this, truly fascinating figure.
Well, thank you, Graham, and thanks for the opportunity to appear on Everyday Anarchism. It's a wonderful podcast, and I'm very happy to speak to you and to your listeners today about Wilde.
Okay, let's go ahead and start. Can you tell us a little bit about his background and sort of what brought him into radical circles as well as literary circles, of course?
Yes. Well, with Wilde, with his background, he's Irish, and I've recently written a book on Wilde and his politics and how this influences all of his literary writing, his radical politics. And Wilde couldn't be anything but radical. Couldn't be anything but a revolutionary, because being born in the colonial circumstances of Ireland during the 1850s, he was born in 1854 to parents who were very prominent in Irish nationalist circles. His mother, Jane Francesca Wilde, her maiden name was Jane Elgie. Jane Francesca Wilde was one of the most famous militant Irish Republican poets of the 1840s, and also she wrote essays and was a journalist too, calling for, in one essay, Jacta alia est, to die is cast. She called for a revolution that would overthrow the British rule in Ireland. She wrote that essay in 1848, at the height of what's it's popularly known as the Great Irish Famine. When the country was starved into total submission by the British. It wasn't a famine because food was produced and exported at gunpoint by the British military. And Jane Wilde recognised this and writes a poem, The Stricken Land, that ends, "We'll arraign ye as our murderers, the spoilers of our land." And it's a poem about the dead rising up to point their fingers at the British, who she believed had murdered them. So Wilde was born in the decade following, actually, I prefer to call it the Irish Holocaust. It continues well into the 1850s, roughly 1853. Wilde is born a year later in 1854, and Ireland has been catastrophically affected by this. Wilde is born into this environment, an environment of colonial violence as well. It's a police state. There are more British troops stationed in Ireland in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, 80s than there are in India, which is a far larger colonial possession for the British. And his mother is a very key figure. His father was also a famous statistician, writer in his own right as well. He was a kind of Orientalist writer. He had more of a colonial perspective than Wilde's mother. She was an anti-colonialist. And he was also a linguist as well. And Wilde, he used to sing lullabies to Oscar Wilde in Irish, the native language of Ireland, which at that time was also being eradicated by the British in the years after the Holocaust of the 1840s. So his parents were very significant, and this influences all of Wilde's work as well. This experience of colonialism, of imperial violence, and I suppose we can talk about that as we proceed through the discussion. All of his literary work, I think, bears that imprint. He goes to Trinity College in Dublin for 3 years. He attends Trinity in 1871, and then in 1874 he wins a scholarship to attend Oxford University. Both at Trinity and at Oxford he studies classics and excels in both universities. He was fluent in about 4 languages: Greek, 5, English, Greek, Latin, French, and German. We also believe he could speak Russian as well. He could certainly read in Russian. He was, by the 1880s, he's reviewing it's either Tolstoy or Dostoevsky in editions that haven't been translated into English yet. So he's a gifted linguist, as was his mother and his little sister as well, who died at the age of 12 in an accident. She died at the age of 12, and he had 2 half-sisters who died in an accident, but his little sister, Isola, dies from fever at the age of 12, but she too was a remarkable figure in her own right. He graduates with a double first from Oxford in 1878. So the Irishman goes to England and conquers Oxford, and he performs famously there. While at Oxford, he becomes acquainted with Walter Pater, the famous aesthete, and the aesthetes or aesthetes, it's pronounced both ways. These are people who believe that art is really the greatest, the highest, the most important pursuit of and for humanity. And what really interests me about Wilde, and a lot of biographers have, I think, deliberately ignored this, overlooked it, and not included it in their writings on Wilde. Wilde argued that aestheticism, that aesthetics, that the enjoyment of that which is beautiful, that which is artistic, should be afforded to everyone. And he made that very explicit throughout his career. So he had a very democratic belief in that. And Wilde was also an individualist, being an aesthete or aesthete as well. The aesthetic movement championed the individualism of the artist, and Wilde was very interested in this. But I think what gets distorted in Wilde's studies is that he saw individualism as a very social practice. And this again feeds into his anarchism as well. And I think that you see this in a lot of the really interesting, I think the best writers of the 1880s and the 1890s, early 1900s, that there's a very interesting overlap between literary practice and anarchism as well. And the movement, the anarchist movement in the 1880s and 1890s, it wasn't a fringe movement by any means. It was certainly central to the global transnational revolutionary political scene. And Constance Bontman has written some brilliant work on this in terms of anarchist political organization and journalism and so on. And Wilde, I think, was very much central to this. He graduates from Oxford, then he proposes to the Dublin society beauty and his childhood sweetheart, Florence Balcombe, who breaks off the engagement after a short while and then goes on to marry Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula.
Oh, I did not know that connection. Fascinating.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting, and Stoker knew Wilde as well. And this is the interesting thing about Wilde, is that he grew up in the company of Stoker and Florence Balcombe, but at the same time, when he moves to London shortly after the engagement ends, he positions himself at the centre of the literary and cultural and journalistic scenes as well, and he becomes quite prominent very quickly. What I found in my research for my recent book on Wilde was that at the same time, he's also repeatedly harangued, harassed, and condemned and criticised by the British conservative press. They actually, throughout the 1880s into the 1890s, they actually describe him as a terrorist, as a Fenian. The Fenians were the Irish militant Republicans. For US listeners, I suppose I should explain that Irish Republicans are very different from American Republicans. They're the people who want to establish an independent Irish Republic. an all-Ireland republic across the whole country that would be independent of British rule entirely, influenced by the French Revolution and by the Enlightenment. And so Wilde is, from the beginnings of his career, his literary career in the early 1880s, he's constantly associated with Irish republicanism. And this continues into, for example, reviews of his famous novel of 1891, The Picture of Dorian Gray. It's described as a very Fenian novel by the critic William Ernest Henley in the Scots Observer, a charge that Wilde felt he had to answer. He tours the United States and is very successful in 1882. It's a commercial success, but it also draws very considerable audiences too. And again, through the tour of the United States, he is actually criticized, condemned again, as his sexuality is also questioned at this point too, which is very interesting. And he's described as a, and I quote, dunghill he-hen. As they're trying to portray him as effeminate physically and everything. He was quite a big, strong man. And I know we're, in terms of masculinity, femininity, and all of this stuff's neither here nor there, but they were trying to construct him as very effete, as they had done in the British press as well. But the US press were very deliberate with that. There was a lot of lies and propaganda circulated about him. And in the United States, several occasions, he calls for the British to leave Ireland, criticizes British rule. And he also, throughout the tour, argues that aestheticism is really something that should be enjoyed by and belong to the people, and in particular the workers. And he argues that, and he's renowned for being something of a he dresses in the aesthetic fashion. He wears knickerbockers and tassels and those ruffled shirts that I forget the name of and so on. But he argues that this is actually very real stuff. This stuff matters, because if we don't have access to art and beauty, then what is life? And it's a bit like the Lawrence textile strike, bread and roses. That's what Wilde argues in the United States and in Ireland and Britain during the 1880s and then on into the 1890s. He publishes his first poetry collection in 1881 entitled Poems. In 1878, his poem Ravenna won the Newdigate Prize, which was a very prestigious poetry prize at Oxford. And then by the late 1880s, he's writing short stories as well that are published in various literary journals and magazines. And his short stories, his fairy tales, are deeply political, very deeply political. They address state violence, economic violence, which is the violence of capitalism, really, particularly violence against children. And throughout all of this, he's applying, I think, to within his aestheticism, a very anarchist aesthetic. But his anarchism is formed out of the anti-colonial experience too. And just to emphasize to listeners that the two aren't exclusive. They're actually, in many cases, in many anti-colonial struggles, anarchism and anti-colonialism thrive and flourish together. And it's actually one of the great, I think it's one of the very beautiful things about the development of struggles across the world, and people, as Wilde did, learn through experience. And then Wilde applied this to his literary writings as well. By the 1890s, then he becomes renowned too as a writer of brilliant social dramas as well, social comedies. Really, they're all comedic. All of his plays, An Ideal Husband, A Woman of No Importance, and so on. And famously, his most famous play, The Importance of Being Earnest. And all of these plays are really political. They're anti-imperial. By the time he's writing The Importance of Being Earnest, like much of the humor centers on bourgeois anxiety about working class organization and working class revolt as well. And some of that too filters into the Picture of Dorian Gray's novel of 1890 in its serial publication, published in novel form in 1891. Famously, of course, he in 1891 he meets and falls in love with Alfred Douglas. He got married in 1884. I think it was 1884 to Constance Lloyd. Yeah, they got married in 1884, and Wilde, a few years later, meets his friend, first it's reckoned that Robert Ross, a young Canadian, was his first gay lover. I'm not too sure about that. Again, I think that Wilde's sexuality was ambivalent at an earlier stage, possibly around when he starts in Oxford and so on too, when he starts studying in Oxford. But he's married in 1884. He and Constance have two children, Vivian and Cyril is the eldest. Then Vivian follows. He was a great father figure to his sons, and recently too, some recent scholarship. Joseph Bristow, who's I think the world's leading Wilde scholar, he's based at UCLA. Professor Bristow has pointed out too that Constance's relationship with Wilde was actually more let's say more open and progressive than traditional biographies have assumed as well. Men would stay over with Wilde, and she knew about this as well at their own home as well. So Wilde then meets Alfred Douglas in 1891, I think it is, 1891. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, 1891 is a precise date, and falls madly head over heels in love with this very handsome young aristocrat who's the son of the Marquis of Queensberry, who invents the Marquis of Queensberry rules, the boxing rules. The father was quite the maniac and quite aggressive as well, and quite a homophobe. And what happens then is that Wilde is drawn into confrontation between father and son in 1895 at the premiere of The Importance of Being Earnest, February 1895. The Marquis of Queensberry leaves a note for Oscar Wilde with a bouquet of rotten vegetables and addresses this to Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite. He couldn't spell sodomite, and yeah, and Wilde takes the Marquis of Queensberry to court. He charges him with libel. He takes a libel suit against him, and during the libel trial, Queensberry is defended by Edward Carson, who goes on to become the leader of the Ulster, the north, not even all of Ulster, but the northeast of Ireland Orange faction, the Unionist faction, which still dominates politics in some ways in the northeast of Ireland today. He becomes a champion of the imperial cause there later on, but he defends Carson, appoints a number of private detectives to muckrake through Wilde's life, and then Wilde is unable to really deflect this in court. And although he performs brilliantly, constantly, the focus is on his sexuality. So Wilde then withdraws the libel case, and on the grounds of that, it's assumed by the British judiciary that Wilde has actually been is homosexual, and he's charged then with gross indecency under the Criminal Amendment Act, the Labouchere Amendment to the Criminal Justice Act, sorry. And he's then tried and sentenced, found guilty, and sentenced to 2 years hard labour, which he serves in a number of prisons. In prison, he then writes the famous letter to Alfred Douglas, which becomes known as De Profundis, from the depths, from I think January, February to April 1897. And afterward, then he writes the ballad. He also writes the Ballad of Reading Gaol, which is a famous condemnation of really the capital punishment, still very relevant today as well. So sorry, that's a bit of a drawn out, potted sort of biographical background. I just wanted to emphasize that Wilde, through all of this, he is deeply political as well. The trial becomes famously remembered, or it becomes a landmark trial, and this is where we find, I think, too, with Wilde, we find anarchism, queerness, anti-colonialism all coming together, and that's what we find in all of his writings, and it's a wonderful mixture of all of these things.
Okay, that's fantastic. I mean, just a few things I want to highlight. One is that it's hard. I think it's hard, especially for people who were born in the past 20 or 30 years. Honestly, anyone who doesn't remember the 1920s or thereabouts, to understand Ireland. We've grown up with, first of all, Irish Americans, for those who in America are fully in the political and elite ruling class and fully part of the white system and the white supremacist system. That was not the case, even up until the Kennedy presidency. There were still, questions about whether the Irish belonged in America. And then, of course, Ireland and its economic success story over the last few decades has made Ireland, a place where people associate with wealth and power and banks and that sort of thing. You cannot be thinking of that Ireland when you're thinking of the 19th century. It's simply not. I'm sorry, go right ahead.
No. I think you're very right. That's something, and this is, I think this is the best way to read literature too, from our moment in the present, and then to go back to the points in which it's originally written, and to think about these contexts. Because yes, the situation with Ireland in the 19th century, it was a heavily garrisoned colony. It was ruled through total violence. It was ruled through, there were, I forget the exact figure, but well over 100 coercion acts. And these are acts, coercion acts allow for internment without trial. They allow for the suppression of entire districts, county-wide and larger than counties as well. Whole districts are placed under martial law. We have a paramilitary police force then and now. In the occupied part of Ireland, in the 6 counties, we in Ireland also in this period, we have food restriction and constriction as well. Something that's actually coming back into play as a norm that I'm seeing here. I live in England now and I work here. Access to food, access to energy, all of these things are drawing. There's not all of these neoliberal forms of neoliberal violence very much draw on the colonial practices of the 19th century. And yeah, and when we find with the Irish in America, by the time they become, the famous term is how the Irish become white, isn't it?
Yes.
No, is it Noel Ignatius, I think, writes that book. When Wilde goes to the United States, he's confronted. There are a lot of cartoons depicting him as an ape. They're depicting him alongside the same. He appears in the same cartoons alongside racist stereotypes of African Americans as simian figures, as apes and monkeys and so on. And the Irish are very much, I know this kind of changes as you go from the East Coast through to the West Coast, because apparently by this point, the Irish are becoming well more established in the West Coast, particularly San Francisco, I think. But still these and then they become in control of the city, the police force and various things, as happens to in Boston, New York, Chicago. But the Irish in the 1880s are very much seen as from that period of mass exodus of refugees in the United States from Ireland from the 1840s onward. They're seen as subhuman, much in the same way as African Americans are. And these are all solidarities that are worthwhile for Irish Americans, I think, to think about today, as well as they read these 19th century texts. I was just reading Thoreau's book Walden recently, his memoir, and there's some really interesting anti-Irish digs in that too. The Irish are portrayed as being almost like beast-like, with webbed feet and living in bogs and so on. But anyway, yeah. So Wilde, when he tours the United States, he really finds himself in the middle of that. I'm actually currently writing a book on depictions of Wilde in the United States, particularly in San Francisco.
Oh, fascinating. Yeah. So any rhetoric you can think of that's being deployed against, in the U.S. context, deployed against, say, refugees from Central and South America, or in the European context, whether you're talking about refugees from Africa or those dreaded Central and Eastern Europeans who were allowed to have crummy jobs in London until Brexit came along. Any of that sort of xenophobic, racist rhetoric that you can think of in the 21st century, you can find it deployed against the Irish in the 19th century. And that can get you a long way towards understanding the radicalism that Oscar Wilde came out of. The next thing I want to get to is, this milieu that Wilde was in, especially, people like Ruskin and Morris, people who connected aesthetics and politics. Well, I don't know about Ruskin. Morris didn't like the idea of politics, but let's say aesthetics and radicalism. And then I think that will get us into this text, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, in which he really does, it really is an aesthetic document, he really does claim beauty for everyone. And there's I mean, I would say maybe a Marxist tradition, or whatever you want to say. There's a tradition of socialism that is less concerned with beauty, that is concerned with materialism in its barest and meanest way. This is not a tradition of socialism that I am, personally that interested in. And someone like Morris, and above all Wilde, as well as Kropotkin, offers us a different way. So I thought you could maybe talk about where he's situated with those men and their ideas, and then we can head into the text itself.
Yeah, well, this is the thing. With Wilde, what we find is real correspondence in terms of ideas with Kropotkin. He met Kropotkin on a few occasions, several occasions at least. He describes him as the great white Christ coming out of Russia, which and is it the soul of man under socialism, and he uses that again in some of his letters too. Sorry, it's De Profundis. He describes him as such in De Profundis, yeah, and from the depths. He personally knows both he and William Morris, and we have Ruskin, with whom he works on a project, a road paving project just outside Oxford as well. And the idea is to create a beautiful kind of roadside for workers to enjoy, and plant it with flowers as well as paving the road, and to give the students an experience of graft as well, I suppose, of some of work, of labour. And so Wilde is very much in the centre of this political literary matrix as well. He is at this time, I'm just trying to remember some of the exact quotations. They're all over the book that I've written, but but he's very close to Peter, as well as knowing Peter Kropotkin. Thomas Hasty Bell is a friend of Wilde's as well, and Hasty Bell was a Scottish anarchist who ended up in Los Angeles, and I had the good luck to work on Bell's papers at the Clark Library in the University of California at Los Angeles, and also at the Huntington Library. And he, in turn, was a correspondent of Upton Sinclair. And I was just reading The Jungle there, Sinclair's novel, in which he describes social crime, and then moves on to quote from The Ballad of Reading Gaol about how these pressures produce despair and so on. But back in Wilde's time, Bell was a contemporary of his in London. Bell ends up being arrested in Paris. Also in Paris, he knows quite a few of the French anarchists, including Félix Fénelon. Fénelon was an essayist, journalist, editor, and author as well. And Fénelon's very, very interesting. He was charged with terrorist activities in the Procès de Trente, which was the trial of the 30. And is that 1894? And it's actually undermined, completely taken apart by Fénelon himself through satire, his satirical replies to the prosecutors in court. He spends a lot of time with Fénelon after his release from prison in 1897. He spends the rest of his life largely in France, but with a few trips to Tuscany and Italy too. He is also friendly with John Barlas, a Scottish anarchist and poet. Barlas attended a rally in 1887, which became known as Bloody Sunday, and it was to call for clemency for the Haymarket martyrs, the people who eventually were executed, the Haymarket prisoners, the accused. And the police attacked it and killed 2 people. It was a mass demonstration involving Irish nationalists and Republicans, trade unionists, anarchists, socialists, communists, Marxists. Everybody was there. Charitable types of people, radical Christians as well. And people were attacked by British troops, but by mounted cavalry. They were beaten, they were clubbed, they were bayoneted, they were throttled and strangled. And poor Barlas suffered a head injury. He was clubbed by police constables and never quite recovered. He suffered from emotional mood swings and manic depressive episodes. And in 1891, on the 31st of January 1891, Barlas fires a number of shots at the Speaker's house in the Palace of Westminster. And he's dragged off by police. He's caught with more ammunition and a revolver. And Wilde went bail for Barlas. Barlas writes to Wilde to thank him. And again, this is the connection between poetry and anarchism and literature and all of these things and art. and he thanks him for his generosity. And Wilde provided a character reference and appeared at the court hearings to make sure his friend was okay. And Wilde replies, "I couldn't have done anything else." The exact quotation that follows is, "We poets and dreamers are all brothers." And it was a great act of solidarity. And we also have, the broader anarchist and activist and writerly scene at that point as well. Alexander Cohen, who is a Dutch anarchist who is he's exiled from Paris because one of his friends commits a couple of bombing attacks in Paris. Émile Henry, one of his contacts, Cohen ends up in London, and he actually writes an article in The Torch. He attended Wilde's trial, according to the Wilde critic Mark Samuel Lasner, and Cohen attends the trial and then argues that Wilde is tried on a number of grounds. He's tried for his homosexuality, tried for his Irishness, and he's tried for his literary genius. And these are all three things that cannot be tolerated by the state in this period, by the British imperial state. So we have, he knows he's a friend too with George Bernard Shaw, who's more of a statist anarchist as well, and a very key figure in the literary scene. William Butler Yeats is also meets Wilde, and the young Yeats meets Wilde, the Irish poet William Butler Yeats, in the early 1880s, and is enormously impressed by him and really looks up to him. Wilde also, when he's in the United States, makes a point of meeting Walt Whitman. He also likes Thoreau as well, but he meets Walt Whitman and he's speechless, which is unusual for Wilde because he's so eloquent. Yeah, but he's speechless. He's unable to speak the entire evening after they meet, and Whitman really moved Wilde. Whitman, of course, is just brilliant. Brilliant poet, and it's interesting to see with whom Wilde identified and connected. The other anarchist that he knew as well in France was Adolphe Rédé. Rédé, he helped Wilde draft his play Salome, his later play that he writes after. Does he write? Sorry, he writes that in 1893, I think. Yeah, just before, it's one of his mid 1890s plays. And Rédé helps him to prepare the drafts of that too. So anarchism is quite key to all of that, and you see that in all of his writing. So he's immersed in this cultural scene, this literary scene, and this political scene. And I think when you read Wilde, it's worth thinking about these things as not being distinct or separate, but as everyday anarchism for these writers. And that's why I think this podcast is such a great title, because it's an immersion. It's something that's shared.
Yeah, and it's very clear in The Soul of Man Under Socialism that there's not going to be a separation between work, art, and life. That these things are not separate things, which again gets to the everydayness of it. I mean, there must have been people at the time who left-wing people, socialists, who rejected this. So how does Wilde defend the idea of an aesthetic communism? There must have been people who thought that was a contradiction in terms.
This is the thing. During the US tour in the previous decade, he articulates this over and over and over again. And when he goes to the US, he witnesses the kind of scenes that Upton Sinclair describes in The Jungle when he goes to Chicago. He said there's nothing quite like Chicago for industry, mechanized industry, mass industry, and dehumanization. And he knows all about this from the colonial context in Ireland as well. And he sees the poverty that's rampant in England too, and particularly in London where he's living in this period. So he's very conscious of this, and he argues throughout The Soul of Man Under Socialism. Sorry, I'll just get my copy here. There's so many wonderful quotations. It tells us that, let's see here. He starts off by discussing disobedience, but he states that there is the important thing is for the individual. The important thing for the individual is to make what is beautiful. There's nothing necessarily dignified about manual labor. A lot of it, most of it, he tells us, is absolutely degrading, the kind of manual labor that he could see in places like Chicago going on in London and so on, and in Ireland. This is mentally and morally injurious to man to do anything. And this is the important thing, the important part. in which he does not find pleasure. So work should be pleasurable. And this is something that really, I think, really resonates today when we look at how, how work grinds people down, how it destroys the soul, quite literally, as Wilde describes it. Wilde argues that the most important thing for someone to do is to maintain the treasure house of your soul, as he puts it. It's beautifully and poetically put. And he argues as well that throughout, that throughout one's life, that there's much to be enjoyed. And he tells us that, just looking here I have so many quotes here, practically my entire copy here is underlined, that really that alienation is something this is something that he writes about a lot. And he tells us that really work is something that ought to be pleasurable, that we deserve to enjoy the work, and it ought to be constructive. And he tells us that really in the soul of man the soul of man under socialism, that we should not really aim to acquire useless things, but acquire things that enrich us intellectually, spiritually even as well. And he was a very spiritual person, and he didn't see a distinction between spirituality and political belief as well. This is why Kropotkin's the White Christ. He believes, I think, very much in the kind of what becomes known by scholars later as the kind of the historical Christ, the historical Jesus, and so on. So he tells us that because of this, the best among the poor are never grateful. They are ungrateful, discontented, disobedient, and rebellious. They're unhappy with the dehumanizing lot they've been assigned. And he tells us that disobedience, in the eyes of anyone who has read history, is man's original virtue. It is through disobedience that progress has been made, through disobedience and through rebellion. And this disobedience, Wilde tells us, really is a product of really the dehumanization, the alienation, and really the hardening of the spirit that capitalism imposes on people as well. As I say, throughout the US tour, and then later on in the 1880s, he gives lectures about the US tour, but which are really about this issue as well. He condemns and criticizes capitalism for its, for really wearing people down. And this is again key to his short stories as well. So many of the themes in The Soul of Man Under Socialism are already written about in the short stories as well of the late 1880s, early 1890s.
I love his criticism of charity. It lines up for me with, I'm a huge fan of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who is in some ways, the source of many of these ideas, especially if you're going to Thoreau and Whitman. And Emerson is chided to this day for being against charity and against certain forms of organization. But I would say this charity, and if you look at something like what's that stupid movement, effective altruism, it's just the flip side of the hardening of soul of capitalism. It's just taking the money relation, in which it is the superior person's job to extract as much money as possible from people, and inverting it. So it becomes the superior person's job of, giving money to people, but it doesn't break that relation of superiority and hierarchy. And I can imagine people reading Wilde and Emerson and thinking, oh, these people are heartless, they're against charity, but it's so much more radical and beautiful than charity can conceive of.
Yeah, charity is a huge problem for him because he feels that it draws attention away from, from the material realities, the political realities. If you can somehow maybe, I don't know, give bread to someone lying starving in the street, that you're ameliorating, perhaps you're unconscious, but you're not really addressing the system. We have a big crisis with that now in England at the minute with food banks. England, Scotland, Wales, and the British occupied part of Ireland, the 6 counties up in the northeast of Ireland. We have people in jobs going to food banks and so on. And so the idea is that, Wilde saw Victorian charity too as serving a similar purpose, really did deflect from the ongoing crisis. And it's in The Soul of Man Under Socialism. And he writes about it too in an earlier essay on the ancient Chinese anarchist philosopher Chuang Tzu. And he tells us that Chuang Tzu also had a go at philanthropy and so on. And this charity doesn't really change the structural inequalities. It tells us that in the Soul of Man Under Socialism, that the proper aim of the revolutionary is to reconstruct society, as Wilde puts it, on such a basis that poverty will be impossible. Anything else degrades and demoralizes the poor to try and put a sticking plaster on it. Wilde tells us, and he tells us that really the operating principles of capitalism, these can't be reformed because they always make it impossible, and these are Wilde's words, they always make it impossible, quote, to use private property in order to alleviate the horrible evils that result from the institution of private property. So that's what Wilde argued, that charity found itself in a kind of bind, in a circular sort of, really in a circular motion that was going nowhere. It wasn't progress, it was repetition, and it wasn't really really fixing the problem.
Yeah, when you sometimes I speak to people who work for NGOs and things like that, and they have horrible bosses and terrible work practices, and their labor is they're deeply alienated from their labor. And I think Wilde could have predicted that charity can be, for the person working in charity, it's just, you're just extending the system in a way that's just utterly untenable.
This is it. And Wilde asks us there in the Soul of Man, why should they be grateful to poor for the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table? They should be seated at the board and are beginning to know it. Yeah. As for being discontented, a man who would not be discontented with such surroundings and such a low mode of life would be a perfect brute. So he's telling us not to be grateful for these things. And this is actually one of neoliberalism's great contracts. And it was Victorian philanthropy. This is work there's nothing neo or new about neoliberalism. It really is. It has adapted, updated, modernized, but the practices of 19th century laissez-faire capitalism, which was incredibly violent in its own ways, and it's rebranded them. And this is why Wilde is always so striking, and this is why he tells us disobedience is man's original virtue. And he tells us that then to recommend thrift, as you get from many charities in the 19th century, it's all over Dickens. Read Charles Dickens, and as Orwell said of Dickens, it's not a change of system, man. He's a change of heart, man. He's an author who wants to change the heart, but not the system. And Wilde answers those arguments, and he tells us that to recommend thrift to the poor is both grotesque and insulting. It is like advising a man who is starving to eat less. And this is really... And the interesting thing about Wilde's studies in the main is that this stuff then becomes, I've found, and in reviews of my book as well, so some reviews that came out there recently, but also Wilde studies in the mainstream tends to dilute this. So the recent Oxford University Press edition of Wilde's The Soul of Man Under Socialism tells us that, okay, Wilde wrote all this stuff, but he didn't really mean it. It's actually in the editor's introduction. They've actually stated that. And we get a lot of denialism too about Wilde's politics, and here it is. It's in print in front of us, and and if anybody wants to do the broader contextual work, as I've done as well, they'll find that Wilde is part of this grander radical political addressing of these issues, and the thing to emphasize is that Wilde's anarchism was not a kind of fringe thing. Anarchism was very much part of the mainstream of the left. It was very much, it was key to progressive politics in this time.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely crucial. I'm saddened, but I guess not surprised to hear of that denial. I mean, I do think there's some just resistance to the idea. I guess the last thing, as we're heading towards the end, that we can segue into, and this is really important, is there is a belief, certainly a belief in, modern progressive circles, that you cannot have, at least I see this, cooperation without coercion. Your options are sort of some sort of monstrous Nietzschean individualism, and that's even probably more than Nietzsche would advocate for, but at least what people imagine the libertarian Nietzsche would want, or some kind of collectivist statist, centralized option. And Wilde, I think, following Kropotkin, but putting it even more beautifully, thinks that, you know, to be an individual is to be social, and you can't, and it's this is just something that I cannot find getting any purchase right now. If people want people don't want cooperative solutions, they want what we might call collectivist solutions. And Wilde, I think rightly, has suggested that this is, you know, the bludgeoning of the people for the people, by the people.
This is sorry, I just keyed in here while because your point really reminded me of another quote from Wilde in his review of Chuang Tzu's collected writings that were published, I think, in 1891. And he tells us that, and this is statism, we're always presented with this alternative, either, you know, this kind of wild individualism or kind of collectivist sort of statism, socialist statism, and all of that. And, you know, look at how well that worked out. And you know, you look at Ireland as well, for example, in more recent history as well. We had a very we had a peace process that was underwritten by really violent coercion, murderous coercion as well, where state violence was basically contracted out to former progressives, well, you know, out to party militias and so on in the Republican side. And it was terrible, a really terrible period in the late 1990s and into the 2000s, well into hitting, you know, the mid up to almost 2010. And Wilde addresses these contradictions. You know, this is the thing, Graham. He tells us that artificial, he describes in this review of 1891, and it's just before he writes The Soul of Man. He tells us that artificial virtues are concealed within the practices of the state. He calls them artificial virtues, just what you're describing there. The results, he tells us, were so dreadful that the government of the day, back in ancient China, had to bring in coercion. And as a consequence of this, the virtuous men sought refuge in mountain caves, while rulers of the state sat trembling in ancestral halls. Then, when everything was in a state of perfect chaos, the social reformers got up on platforms and preached salvations from these ills that their system had caused. Centralism, The poor social reformers, he declares, they know not shame nor what it is to blush. And the verdict of Chuang Tzu is upon them. Chuang Tzu was I think he's also known as Chung Tzu, or Zhuangzi in China as well, in Mandarin, Zhuangzi. He's a fascinating figure, and Wilde was very taken by him. And he argues that what we have is the coercion of the 1890s, when he writes this, is being colluded in by these reformists as well. And when you look at how things turn out too, you know, with later revolutionary endeavors, and you know, you look at the Spanish Civil War, like, as in some ways I kind of got into Wilde as well, and through reading Orwell, Homage to Catalonia. And it's interesting just to see that Orwell detested Wilde because Orwell was homophobic, but you can see that critique, definitely that anarchic critique of centralized socialism as well, and the dangers inherent within it that Wilde is very interested in.
Yeah, I don't have time to go down this road, but I've been watching some of the wuxia films, the Hong Kong films of heroism, and the hero is always, in some ways, anti-authoritarianism. There's usually a sense that there is maybe a good order that can be restored, but in none of those films is there a good order, and none of them is hierarchy deployed in our, you know, in this, I would say, Orientalist image we have of China as this, or ancient China, or the imagined China as a bureaucratic, authoritarian, Orientalist despotism. When you look at the stories and the heroes and the philosophies that come out of China, it's so often that you don't find that. And I find these anti-authoritarian heroes and philosophers richly developed in every culture of the world. And I see it's such a delight to find someone like Wilde seeing it in these ancient Chinese writings, because it's always there. This, you know, Kropotkin calls it sort of like the struggle of every culture. And we tend to, in my opinion, at least from where we're sitting right now in this historical moment, we seem to always be looking for the state builders, the centralizers, the people who put things, you know, in order, if you want to put it that way. But I agree with Wilde. If progress is happening, it's probably disobedience. Even our superheroes and even our heroic cops are always defying their superiors. We can't even imagine a heroic police officer who isn't in some ways an individualist anarchist. And yet we're told that anarchism has no place in our world.
Yeah, it has that appeal, you see. And I just watched Die Hard over Christmas, and if John McClane had a listen to whatever Lieutenant, whatever his name was on the ground, who was barking orders down the radio, Hans Gruber would still be in the Nakatomi Tower, holding everybody hostage. But it is, and that's the interesting thing too, because Kropotkin looks at this, and Wilde is influenced by this historical perspective, that when we go back, even back to ancient societies as well, and Christian societies and so on, and we see this, and we see this inherent kind of confidence in one's own judgment, one's own ability to stand on one's feet and with one's community. And this is actually, again, this is the great neoliberal and I think Victorian contract as well, was to really undermine that faith in the self. And you're seeing that now. We're seeing it all over, in terms of the crises that are being cultivated by social media and inflicted on young people and so on as well. Everything's kind of mediated and through celebrity. And as Wilde said, it's a treasure house, as he wrote, it's in the treasure house of your soul where you'll find true meaning.
Yeah, and I think you'll find connection there, not through centralization, not through coercive structures, but when you are a true individual, you will be drawn. Emerson says this, and Wilde says this too. You'll be drawn to other individuals, and before you know, you have a non-hierarchical community that of support, of mutual aid, of solidarity.
Yeah. And when we look at, say, more recently, the Irish Revolution of the 1970s, 80s, and into the 90s, the death of that revolution was centralization. When Irish republicanism became hierarchical and centralized, it was over.
Yeah.
It really was, yeah.
Yeah, and Orwell tells that same story about the Spanish Revolution. Absolutely. Okay, well, we could clearly go on for a while, but I think we've done enough. Is there anything else you would like to share with the listeners? Any sort of parting thoughts?
I suppose in parting thoughts, yeah, just if people are feeling we live in frightening times, and we live at it. I have two daughters, and I'm always concerned, and when we think of the future and where things are at and where they're going, but to take Wilde's advice on board and to trust in themselves, trust their judgment, to build that everyday experience that you've centered this podcast around as well, is the treasure house of the soul, to re-emphasize that point. It was so beautifully and poetically articulated by Wilde, because that's where it's at. That's what Kropotkin believed as well, and that's where that's where all these writers of the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, and so on. It's where art and politics is where community collide, where community comes together. And if you can build community in your own way, start with 3 to 4 like-minded people. That's all it takes. Anything's possible.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Deaglán. Such a pleasure.
Thank you too, Graham.